everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us today, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today for our TalentQuest webinar on the role of feedback in driving human behavior. My name is Dina Quasset-Campbell, and I am a member of the communications team here at TalentQuest. We're really excited to have you for the next hour and looking forward to discussing the role of feedback as part of your talent management strategy. Before we get started, I'd like to go over just a few housekeeping items. Right now, all webinar participants are in listen-only mode. Please send any of your questions via the question box that appears at the top right of your screen, and we will do our best to answer as many questions as we can at the conclusion of our presentation. We are offering one SHRM PDC credit for attending this webinar, and we'll give out the code at the end of our session. And lastly, after the webinar, we will be forwarding a copy of the presentation as well as a recording to everybody. So without further ado, our presenter today is Jody Bradham, an executive consultant here at TalentQuest. Jody is a management psychologist with over 10 years of experience as a consultant in the talent management space. He has some great information to share with everyone today, so I'd love to welcome Jody and turn the presentation over. Good afternoon, Jody. Welcome.
Thank you, Dina. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you to the folks out there who are willing to give me a few minutes of your time this afternoon. I know everybody is very busy these days, so the fact that you're willing to allocate 45, 50 minutes to be with me, I appreciate very much. And so to that end, I want to just kind of jump right in with today's webinar, and the title kind of gives the subject matter away a little bit. No news is not good news. Well, we've all heard the saying, no news is good news, and we assume that that means, the waters are calm and carry on. But I'd like to kind of set the context for this webinar by suggesting that it's not only not no news is good news, but it's no news really is not good news. In other words, it could be a real danger from a management and leadership standpoint for there to be that mindset. And so we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the role of feedback in driving behavior. So in this case, feedback is the news. And hopefully, I know feedback is not a new topic to you out there, but what I'd like to do is maybe approach the topic a little bit differently and maybe shine a little bit more light on why it's such a driver of behavior and how it drives behavior. Before we close, we'll also talk about a couple strategies that you can use to increase both the efficiency and the effectiveness of the feedback going forward. So with that said, thanks again for joining me. And let me just start with a premise here. So it's my opinion, belief, experience that a manager's job is simply this. It's to build high-performing teams and to influence the behavior of those teams for maximum benefit to the organization. And really, there are two ways that a manager can do that. On the one hand, a manager always has access to certain levers. These are things like rewards, bonuses, policies and procedures, rules, or in the case of violating those, there's disciplinary procedures and what have you. And all of those are available to managers just about all the time, and all of those are effective tools for influencing the behavior of others. In other words, they're effective tools for getting folks to do what you need them to do. That's the compliance piece. But what I'd like to suggest is, as effective managers and leaders, we really want more from our folks than simple compliance. Instead, we want commitment. And to achieve that, it's my suggestion that managers and leaders can leverage their influence with their teams in order to get that commitment. Where we have highly committed employees, we also have highly engaged employees. And we know from the engagement research that there's a strong ROI for organizations that have higher engagement rates. And so this is kind of the premise for today. Is I do believe that it's a manager's job to build teams and to influence those teams to move in the direction of service of the organization. And in the long term, the benefits are going to be stronger for the manager, for the team, and for the organization as a whole if we work more towards commitment rather than compliance. And so what I mean when I'm describing influence in today's terms is simply this. It's molding the behavior of others in such a way that they are willing to be molded. So we're not talking about manipulating anybody here, of course, but instead we're simply talking about shaping the behavior of others. okay? And to do that, we're going to draw heavily on two psychologists that were prominent in the behavioral psychology movement. On the left is John Watson, and on the right represents B.F. Skinner. For those psychology majors out there, you recognize these names. Excuse me. Back in 1920, John Watson did some research with little Albert there, during which he took little Albert's normal curiosity and excitement and joy at seeing a rabbit and converted that to sheer terror. So not the friendliest experiment there, but one of the things that Watson showed us through that experiment is the behavior of or experiences of others can be totally changed depending on what those experiences are paired with. In this case, the bunny was paired with the clanging of two loud cymbals behind the baby. And over time, that noise was startling to the baby and generated fear. So what started as a curiosity and a natural urge to reach out for the bunny quickly became associated with fear and danger, such that you see the distressed look on his face there. So Watson's takeaway was that we could change the experiences and the behaviors of others simply by making associations in their environment. Excuse me. B.F. Skinner, on the other hand, taught us that if we can gradually reinforce behaviors that gradually move people, or in this case pigeons, in the direction of our ultimate objective, before long we can have pigeons that know how to play ping pong with one another. So we're drawing on Watson and Skinner and the principles that they taught from behaviorism to help us better understand how we can use the environment to shape the behaviors of those around us in service of greater objectives, both on an individual standpoint and from an organizational standpoint. Now, we've seen these principles applied in our daily life just about all the time, but very quickly I'll walk through some examples of this. Again, Watson taught us associative learning. In other words, if we can associate two things together, then we can assume the value or assumed value of one item over another. So marketing has really capitalized on this in the form of celebrity endorsements. Brad Pitt is not necessarily an expert on cologne per se, but if we can associate everything we think of with Brad Pitt when we see this cologne, marketing folks are saying we're more likely to buy that cologne. So it's a way that they're influencing our behaviors through certain associations they're asking us to make. Likewise, we've all been in situations where we see these signs that says, hurry, final sale, all things must go, limited availability. There's a concept called scarcity in the marketing literature that says if we can get folks to believe that our offerings are limited in either number or time, that will increase the individual's sense of urgency and desire to buy or to seek out whatever it is we're offering. The lotto is a pretty straightforward example. When we see the lotto ticket, we very quickly imagine all the things that go along with wealth from a winning lottery ticket, and that in turn motivates our behavior to go and purchase a ticket. The no U-turn sign is simply to represent how common and pervasive a lot of these behavior science principles are in our day-to-day life. You think about what these road signs are intended to do. Not only are they intended to inform, but they're intended to instruct as well. Instruct as to where one can go in order to achieve his or her objectives, but also instruct as to what might happen if one violates those norms. So we see applied behavior science in just about everywhere we look on a day-to-day basis, and all of that is designed to influence our behaviors from one minute to the next. And so for the purpose of today's webinar, I'm sure you're asking, all right, I hear you, Jody, so what's your point? Well, the point is simply this: the more we can understand the impact of our environment, the better we'll be able to utilize that understanding to shape the behavior of others. And in the case of building high-performing teams and driving the behavior of others, that part of the environment that you as managers and leaders can most influence is feedback. And so hence the reason for the webinar today, right? How can we use feedback to drive behavior? Well, first, let's really understand what feedback is. By definition, feedback is a process of feeding back information to an individual about that individual's decisions or behaviors for the purpose of informing future decisions and behaviors. Okay? So the key piece is there. It's feeding back information about something somebody's already done for the purpose of informing future decisions and behaviors. I'm going to emphasize that again later as we talk about how to leverage feedback. But more importantly, it's a normal and ever-present part of our daily lives. It's ongoing in our day-to-day life, so much so that we kind of take it for granted. And I've got several examples here on the screen of what I mean by that. You know, we're in a feedback-rich environment these days. You see the Facebook likes, the Twitter favorites. You know, if I tweet something, you know, all I have to do is wait 10, 15 minutes, and before long, I'm getting feedback on that tweet, right? Folks liked it, folks didn't like it, what have you. For the exercise folks out there, you're familiar with the Fitbit and some of those exercise monitoring devices. And you'll notice when you get your 10,000 steps, what does it do? Well, it vibrates or bells ring or what have you. It alerts you in some way. In other words, it feeds back information to you that you've achieved your 10,000 steps mark. The bills that we pay from one month to the next are simply giving us information back about our usage, such that we can be informed and make decisions on what we want to do, if anything, differently next month. Dieters who are constantly standing on the scale or pulling out the measuring tape, that's another source of feedback. So at the core here, when we talk about what feedback really is, this is what I mean. It's how we understand both what we're doing and how we're doing relative to our objectives, okay? So it's an important and natural part of our day-to-day lives. And in fact, even in the workplace, feedback is a built-in component to our daily work. You know, it comes in different formats. We've got annual reports, shareholder reports, budget reports, customer satisfaction scores, profit indexes, P&L statements, what have you. All of those are indicators relative to past decisions and behaviors so that you can be better informed for future decisions and behaviors. So it's a natural part of our day-to-day life and a natural part of our workplace life. But here's something that's interesting, is that when it comes to personal feedback, especially in the workplace, as prominent as feedback is everywhere else in our lives, when it comes to personal feedback in the workplace, it just doesn't seem to be happening. Or if it does happen, it usually happens in what I call either scheduled conversations or consequential conversations. Those scheduled conversations equate to basically your performance review, you know, a 90-day check-in, 6-month midpoint evaluation, or what have you. It's scheduled conversation. Those consequential feedback conversations are, as the name implies, it's usually after something has occurred. Either you've had a tremendous victory, and so we're going to celebrate that with some feedback, or there's been a significant mistake or oversight, and we want some feedback around that. So it's better than nothing, but I'd like to suggest that it seems odd if feedback is so ever present everywhere else in our lives, and if the ultimate purpose of feedback is to instruct and inform future behaviors, why would it not be present in our day-to-day work life as well? In fact, not having personal feedback on an ongoing basis in the workplace would be a lot like taking the speedometer out of your car and not only not knowing what you're doing from a speeding standpoint, but not finding out until after you've already been pulled over and gotten your ticket. It just doesn't make any sense. And so, you know, it makes you scratch your head and wonder, well, if it's that common and that prominent, why isn't it happening more in the workplace? And I'd like to suggest, based on experience, that what happens is based on people's prior experiences in some form or fashion, feedback has been converted from a source of information, a tool, an aid, a gift in some ways that we can give to those around us, to instead being something that's threatening. It's a hassle. It takes too much time, or it's asking for conflict. It's inconvenient, or in some other way, it just creates stress that we don't want or need. And over time, we just stop giving it. And I've learned over the years this little saying here at the bottom: what we fear in life, we avoid. Lions, tigers, bears, but also what we avoid in life, we begin to fear. So in other words, the more removed we get from the regular practice of providing feedback, the more awkward, uncomfortable, stressful, inconvenient, intimidating it begins to be, which only reinforces the desire to avoid it even more. So I'd like to suggest that there is hope for overcoming that. And our goal really becomes to just tame that paper tiger and begin to see feedback, even negative feedback or critical feedback, as an opportunity to shape the behavior of somebody else. Okay? It's not about judgment. It's not about evaluation, but it's about how can we help folks be successful tomorrow through leveraging the information of today or yesterday. Okay? So just to kind of make one little business case here for feedback in the workplace, this was research done by Gallup back in 2009, but as published in Workforce Management back in 2010. And what they did was they surveyed folks about their experiences in the workplace, and they divided employees into three categories. In one category, you had employees who received only positive feedback from their managers. And in another category, you had folks who only received negative or critical feedback from their managers. And in that third category, these were folks that described getting almost no feedback. So they were labeled as being ignored workers. Well, as you see from the chart here, the blue bar represents the percentage of folks who identified themselves as being highly engaged in their work. So for those folks who worked under highly positive feedback-oriented managers, 61% were labeled in the engaged category. 61% of respondents identified as being highly engaged in their work. Interestingly, though, that second group, even those who had predominantly negative feedback from their supervisors or managers, 45% of those were still saying they were engaged. It's not until we get into that third category, that category of ignored employees, where we see that engagement drop to 2%. So it's pretty interesting kind of data there, and it validates experience that we've had here at TalentQuest as well. When you think about what this takeaway message is, it's in some ways I think it's very enlightening, but I also hope it's an invitation and a permission-giving opportunity for you to embrace the need for feedback. Because essentially what this is saying is that folks would rather hear criticism and negative feedback than nothing at all. So you have permission to give feedback, and not only do you have permission, but you have folks who are asking for that feedback in order to be fully engaged in their workforce. And again, with so much research out there on engagement, we've talked about this a couple of times here in these webinars, there's a tremendous direct relationship between highly engaged employees and various measures of productivity, employee turnover, and other performance benchmarks. And so it behooves most organizations to do what they can to raise engagement levels. And this data suggests that one way to do that is simply to start bringing feedback into the equation a little bit more often. Now, if the business case isn't compelling to you, let me just come at it from a leadership standpoint. And this is an example or this is a quote from Karen May, the Vice President of People Development at Google. She says, one of the most valuable things I could do for someone was to tell them exactly what nobody else had told them before. She felt like it was not only part of her job, but it was a part of her responsibility as a leader to simply get folks the feedback that they need in order to position themselves for success going forward. In many organizations, feedback is seen as somewhat taboo, or it's too sensitive, or maybe it's not my job, or what have you. And the net of that is that our employees don't ever really know the impact they're having, or to what degree they are or are not going off track. So she saw it as being part of being a leader, is to provide that feedback. So if we think about feedback and how to leverage it most effectively in our environment, I want to leave you with just these two things. One, from a business standpoint, feedback relates to direct connection to bottom line functioning, productivity, engagement, and ultimate ROI. But for those of you who are more aligned with and identify more with your own leadership effectiveness, feedback is a way to enhance your leadership effectiveness by way of building and supporting those underneath you for success. All right, so let's talk about how to use that feedback effectively to drive behavior. So I'm assuming you're all on board with the value of feedback and the need for feedback, and have a certain understanding of how it works. But let's talk about how to use it to really drive behavior. And I'm going to start with this. Feedback is not just about the message. And in fact, it's also about the messenger, and in some cases, I would say even more so about the messenger. Now, this is research that was published by the Journal of Managerial Psychology in 2004. And the quote here, employees are motivated to improve their job performance based on unfavorable feedback when the feedback source is perceived to be credible, the feedback is of high quality, and the feedback is delivered in a considerate manner. So notice that even with negative feedback, folks are willing to make changes. But 2 out of the 3 conditions that need to be present for that are related to the messenger. That's pretty powerful. So the takeaway here is, look, you don't even have to be perfect in the message itself, in the way it's crafted. But what is going to be important is that the messenger is somebody that is willing to be, for folks to be willing to listen to. And that's the reason for the image here of Martin Luther King Jr. You know, he was willing to put himself out in the forefront to deliver a message, a very powerful message, and in many ways, a very provocative, controversial message that at that time in our country's history was very much a risky message to be promoting. And yet it was because of all the things that Martin Luther King Jr. brought, it was because of the messenger that folks were willing to listen to the message over time. And here we are today with all of the progress that's been made, largely due to the efforts and the character and the presentation of the message by somebody like Martin Luther King Jr. So again, and there are lots of other examples out there, but when we talk about giving feedback, the risk is not so much in what we say, but are we bringing something that folks are willing to listen? So with that said, how can you be an effective messenger? Especially for any new managers that are out there, I want to ask you to consider these things and think back on your own experiences there. Number one, I want you to accept your role and responsibilities, first as an influencer of others. So we go back to my original premise that it's my opinion that a manager's job is to build high-functioning teams and to influence the behavior of those high-functioning teams in service of the organization. So you're an influencer of others. And if you can't or don't accept your role and your responsibility as that, feedback is going to be something that's just going to be difficult for you to provide, right? But I also encourage you to accept your role as a driver of culture. When folks are moved into management roles, whether they're frontline supervisors or senior level managers, the expectation is that they will be consistent and representative of the culture that's trying to be promoted by the organization. Therefore, simply by position alone, you begin to be a driver of culture. And so if we want the benefits of a feedback-rich environment, as we saw, there's some financial reasons to do that, then you have to embrace your role as a driver of the culture. And I always have found feedback to be a true gift in terms of setting people up for success going forward. And in my experience as well, I've also found that leaders who approach their roles as being more teachers of others than bosses of others have frequently been more effective. And so if we see feedback as a way to help people to learn and to grow, then one needs to accept their role as a teacher in order to be comfortable delivering that feedback. Look in the mirror there. This is saying, look, again, the effectiveness of feedback to a large degree depends on the messenger, him or herself. And so what I'm suggesting here is you need to be aware of what your own avoidance behaviors are. How can you tell when you're resisting giving feedback, or when you're letting your anxieties kind of delay feedback or soften the feedback or what have you? You need to recognize your own avoidance behaviors and then be able to manage that anxiety. And as you do that, you want to be able to prepare yourself to be able to deliver feedback with the right spirit. And what I mean by the right spirit is that feedback, again, is an instructional tool. It's a gift, it's a tool, it's an opportunity that we can use to help people be successful in the future. If we're coming with a spirit of critique, criticism, hit somebody over the head, be stuck in the past, then the effectiveness of that feedback is quickly going to be lost. So prepare yourself before giving this feedback to recognize what your avoidance behaviors are and how is that impacting your desire or willingness to give that feedback. Manage that anxiety, and before you go into that conversation, make sure that you're coming with the right frame of mind. And last, this bullet here, build your credibility. You've got to be willing to ask for and listen to feedback from others. If we really want to create a feedback-rich environment, an environment where feedback is not seen as threatening, right? We want to break the association. Go back to John Watson and little Albert. We want to break the association between feedback and anxiety, feedback and fear, feedback and threat, okay? In order to do that, we've got to create new associations. One of the ways to do that is by you as a manager and leader being willing to ask for and listen to feedback from others. It seems to be a truism that folks follow others based more on what they see than what they hear. So a manager that goes around promoting the benefits of feedback and encouraging feedback, and yet who's not willing to ask for and receive feedback is sending a mixed signal. And where there's confusion, folks will look more to what they see than what they hear, which ultimately will undermine your credibility. So you've got to be willing to ask for and listen to the feedback from others if you want to be able to, in turn, provide that feedback to others in a way that they'll be willing to listen. Build up your feedback account. And what I mean by this is, if we go back to the slide here, right, the feedback is delivered in a considerate manner and from somebody that's perceived to be credible. Building up your feedback account is simply saying, look, you've got to take time to invest in the relationship with the people on your team so that they know when you are bringing that feedback, it is with the right spirit. It is with the intent of being helpful. It is with the intent of being instructive. It is with the intent of being supportive for success tomorrow. And it's not with the intent of undercutting or otherwise criticizing or bashing anybody on the team. And this is true even if it's negative or critical feedback, right? I can still tell somebody they've done a lousy job if the way I position that and the fact that they know I have their best interests at heart is felt and received, then I can get away with having such a blunt message. So I say, build up your feedback account. Make sure that you're putting deposits into those relationship accounts so that folks know when you come around to give feedback, you're coming with the spirit of helpfulness, and therefore I'm going to be more likely to listen and be open to it. Be consistent. This is be consistent in your behaviors, but also be consistent in your feedback. Part of credibility is when folks can see and understand what's important to you, what you value, and know that that doesn't change from moment to moment. It also eliminates confusion on the part of others who are receiving that feedback as well. So you want to be consistent in your word and in your deed. And then when you do provide feedback, folks are going to be more likely to see that as credible. And then you want to look for opportunities to give feedback. Don't wait for those scheduled conversations. Those are always kind of a required part of the job, but I'd like to encourage you, were it not for the requirement of the job, don't even think about scheduled conversations. You want to look for any opportunity to provide any feedback that you can, at least on the front end. Again, you're trying to create new associations. You're trying to break the association from the bunny and the clanging cymbals and put it back to the bunny and positive experiences, right? So look for opportunities to give feedback where there's frequent feedback and when it's given with the spirit of being instructive and informative to support future behaviors, right? Then quickly an association begins to form where folks don't feel afraid of feedback, but instead look forward to it and will actually seek it out. That's just true from human behavior standpoint. That's not a tactic or a technique. That's just human behavior, right? So to do that, to be a little more specific, when it comes time to deliver feedback, let's let behavior science help you out with this, okay? So you want your feedback to be timely, okay? So let's say you're ready to provide feedback and you're ready to embrace all that it can offer. So how can I do it most effectively? Well, first and foremost, you want your feedback to be timely, okay? Think about the difference between getting a score back on a test versus getting your grade back at the end of a semester on a report card. Both of those are feedback, right? The test is giving you information back relative to how you performed on that test to inform you going forward for the next test. The report card is giving information back to you relative to how you performed in the class overall. The difference between the two is you still have time to do something about the test or the next test, but you don't have time to do anything with that class that's finished. So we want that feedback to be timely. Whenever you see something, whenever you experience something, whenever you hear something, don't wait for that scheduled conversation. That's the same as waiting till the end of the term to turn the grade report in, right? As soon as you hear something or as soon as you can, give that test grade back so folks can know right then, do I need to course correct or do I need to stay steady as she goes? Feedback should be unequivocal. Now, you're all familiar with the feedback sandwich out there, right? Where we say, I've got something critical I need to tell you, but I'm gonna sandwich that with a compliment or positive feedback on one side and positive feedback on the other side. Okay, the feedback sandwich is what that's called. There are some situations where that's fine. But what I'd like to propose, and I'll even challenge you, is just get rid of the feedback sandwich, okay? Feedback needs to be unequivocal. There needs to be no ambiguity or lack of clarity in the message that you're trying to convey. If I give a feedback sandwich, what I'm going to hear is what I want to hear. You've given me 3 things to listen to, and I'm going to pick the one that I'm going to listen to the most. If I'm really trying to teach, and if I'm really trying to inform, then there needs to be absolute clarity in the message. So I'd suggest that we get rid of the feedback sandwich and simply say it. If you did a great job on this, that, or the other thing, say you did a great job on this, that, or the other thing. But if you blew it, that was a bad decision, that was a mistake, that was an oversight, you probably should have responded differently, then don't hesitate to say that as well. Remember, it's not as much sometimes about the message as it is the messenger. So if I'm somebody who's already perceived as somebody who's willing to help, support, and set my people up for success, then I don't have to soften my message. Folks will already know the spirit from which I'm coming. And then be specific. So let's go back to the speedometer example, right? Imagine the difference between having a speedometer that simply said stopped, slow, or fast, right? That doesn't really tell you anything in terms of how you're doing and what you're doing relative to your objectives, right? Which by definition is what we want from feedback. So the more specific you can be in the information you feed back to an individual, the more informed and well positioned they will be to make decisions about future decisions and behaviors, okay? So we want it to be timely, we want it to be unequivocal, and we want it to be specific. But I also suggest you start small, right? Think back on any other learning that you've engaged in. All learning starts with initial increments. I've got a chord pattern up here on the screen here. I've been trying to learn guitar forever, self-taught, not necessarily the recommended way to go, if you want my opinion on that one, but I'm starting small. I'm simply learning chords. And the more comfortable I get with the chords, the more resonant the sound will be that I generate, which in turn will reinforce me to continue to stay engaged in the learning process. If we wait for folks to close a deal, or if we wait for folks to achieve that 20% return, or if we wait for folks to make it to the next level before we give feedback, we're doing a disservice to them, and we run the risk of losing their attention, their engagement, and their motivation over the long haul, right? So I'm suggesting start small. When it comes to closing the deal, let's don't wait until they close the deal. But if they're doing anything that is in service of closing the deal that you think is something you'd like to see more of, capitalize on that. If they return the phone call, 24 hours sooner than they normally do, give feedback on that. If they delayed the phone call 24 hours longer than they should have, give feedback on that. Start small. We don't have to wait for the outcomes to give feedback. We want to give feedback just like with our speedometer and just like with the Fitbit. We want feedback to be ongoing. And think about your ratio here, okay? Now, this is human nature again and behavior science. And human nature says that we tend to remember negative experiences more than and longer than we do our positive experiences. We could have a whole separate webinar on why that is and some of the evolutionary implications of that. But the fact is we remember the negative stuff longer than we remember the positive stuff. So to that end, we need to be mindful of our ratio, and to the degree possible, we need to be working towards about 5 to 7 positive feedback comments for every one negative or critical feedback moment that you have, okay? And again, if we're honoring that ratio, and if we're starting small, right, and if we're doing it timely, and if folks make the association as it relates to the spirit with which we're bringing it, it should be very easy to achieve that ratio. Folks will be willing and able to hear the negative, but not get hung up on it. And likewise, they will be willing and eager to hear the positive, but to see it in context, okay? So let's think about that ratio as you go forward and try to integrate feedback into your environment there. And last, and maybe most importantly, because you've heard me kind of reiterate it over the course of the webinar here, is let's focus on the future. I use the windshield and rearview mirror metaphor. I'm sure you've all seen or heard that before. The rearview mirror represents just a small proportion of the overall glass in the front of the car. The rear view is great for looking at the past, but what's more important is looking at where we're trying to go. And so feedback really is intended to instruct and inform decisions and behaviors for tomorrow. We learn from the past and apply it in the present so that we can influence the future. When you're giving feedback, if there's not an opportunity to inform or instruct behaviors in the future, I'd suggest you're probably losing opportunity to give effective feedback. So go back, revisit that same message, and let's talk about how we can set somebody up for success in the future, okay? This is all behavioral science. All of this stuff is talking about, this is all stuff that John Watson, B.F. Skinner, Bandura, all these other, E.L. Thorndike, all these other behaviorists have taught us. And so just to kind of make the connection clear again, what is it about Skinner and Watson? Well, look, providing feedback is a way of changing the environment, right? And by environment, I mean something that exists outside of a person. Feedback is a way of changing the environment and influencing the behavior of others such that we can position them for success in the future. And then consistently being the source of opportunity for success for your team gradually is going to cause you to be associated with the positive feelings from your team, which in turn increases engagement, loyalty, and commitment, right? Go back to that first slide. You've got compliance where you got commitment. And so this is not necessarily about a warm fuzzies and making sure everybody feels good, but it's about increasing loyalty and commitment. And one of the ways that we all get that generated is when we know that somebody is really there to look out for us and to support us, even if they're bringing a harsh message, okay? So from that regards, hooray for behaviorism. Thanks to Skinner and Watson and everything that they bring. So here's, there's lots of different ways to deliver feedback. And so what I've shown on the screen here are just 5 models. I know there are way more than this, but for any of you that don't have any models at your disposal, I wanted to at least kind of share a couple with you. And then we'll talk about a couple that I think are better than others, right? So the STAR method here, if we want to provide feedback, we start with the situation or the task. We describe what we saw from the individual, the action they took. and then we describe to them the result of that action. Okay. The situation, behavior, impact, very similar. What was the situation, and what was the behavior the individual engaged in, and what was the impact of that behavior? What I like about that model is we start to bring the impact in, right? When given the choice, most folks are motivated to do the best they can and to have the best outcomes they can. Sometimes they don't always understand the impact of the behaviors they engage in. And until we can help them understand that impact, we don't empower them to make decisions differently. Instead, they rely on us to dictate what they should be doing differently. So I like that we start to introduce the impact of that behavior. Down there at the bottom, we've got aid. Again, very similar. What's the action? What's the impact? But now we introduce a new level, do now. So in the previous slide there, I said make sure we're focused on the future. That do now is a part that speaks to the future. Here was the situation and what you did. Here's the impact of it. But now let's talk about what we want to do going forward. The FAIR model, this is a model that we use a lot here at TalentQuest. We want to be very focused. So remember I said be specific, right? You want to be specific on a situation. You don't want to give feedback on the whole house and the kitchen sink. You want to give feedback on a very specific circumstance or situation. So focus your feedback and then articulate specifically what it was you saw or what the situation was or what resonated with you such that it's motivating the feedback. Again, you want to speak to the impact of what you saw. And then, again, we're talking about the future again. If it was something positive that you want to see more of or you want to see it continue, then recognize that. Recognize that, reward that, reinforce that. If it was something negative or something that you'd like different, then make that request. Help them to know what you want next, okay? Whether it's positive or negative, help folks understand what you need next time, okay? And then the say what, so what, now what. A more simplistic and yet still very powerful model. Say what the situation was. The so what is talking about the impact. And the now what speaks to the future. Where are we going to go from here? Okay. So all of these models can be useful models, but what I would suggest is of the 5, these 2 are less effective than the 3 at the bottom. If for no other reason, they don't explicitly talk about what folks can do going forward. Okay. If we don't bring the future into it, then we're simply asking folks to get stuck in the past, or we're leaving it up to them to figure out what comes next. So when possible, let's instruct folks by giving them information about where they came from, but also guidance on how to get where they're trying to go. Okay. And remember, one of the main purposes of feedback is to help support and position people to be successful in the future. And so just as an example, okay, I want to end with this little exercise, and I'll ask you to kind of play along with me. And imagine that you're entering a clapping contest, okay? I know it's an odd thing to request, but imagine you're entering a clapping contest, and there are 2 rounds. The first round is simply a practice round, and the second round will be the money round, okay? And imagine, if you will, there are 3 judges that you'll be performing in front of, kind of American Idol-like. And so with that kind of scene in mind, imagine these 3 scenarios, right? In scenario 1, you enter the room and you stand in front of the judges, ready for your practice trial. You clap wildly, frantically, and enthusiastically for the required 30 seconds, and then you stop. The judges confer for a second, and Judge 1 gives you a 3 on a 5-point scale. Judge 2 gives you a 2, and Judge 3 gives you another 3. So you leave the room with 3 minutes to prepare for your next performance. That's the feedback you get, right? 2 3s and a 2. In scenario 2, you enter the room and you stand in front of the judges. You clap wildly for the 30 seconds and then you stop. The judges confer again, and one says, I don't really like the fact that you started your applause with such a quick pace. There was no texture to your performance, said another judge. And the beats were way too close together, said the third judge. And added to that, it was just too quiet. It was just way too quiet for my taste. So for that performance, you get 2 3s and a 2. And then you leave the room to prepare. Well, in the third scenario, okay, imagine this. You walk into the room and you clap wildly again for 30 seconds. And at the end of the performance, the judges confer again. You know, what I think really makes an excellent performance, explained the first judge, is a performance that builds. I like it to begin slowly and then to get louder and louder, almost like a crashing wave. What you did was great for the end part, but I would have loved to have had more impact if you created some more contrast between the beginning and the end. The second judge nodded in agreement with that and said, yeah, and you can also increase the crescendo by starting with a slower, quieter clapping, but then getting faster and louder towards the real triumphant ending. But your clapping at the end was really good, though. You're looking for a sharper sound as well, okay? And the third judge says you keep clapping with the middle of your hands, but you really want that sharp sound to give it some definition. I absolutely hate the hollow palm on palm sound. So for that performance, you get 2 3s and a 2, and you walk off the stage to prepare for your performance. Now, think about this. If you were in this contest, you've had 3 different scenarios, and in all 3 scenarios, you were provided feedback. But when we think about the value of feedback for your performance in the money round, which scenario would you rather have been a part of, right? Scenario 1, you just get scores. It tells you nothing about what they liked, tells you nothing about what they didn't like, and therefore gives you no information about what to do differently next time. Scenario 2 was all critical, but at least they told you what they didn't like, right? Scenario 3, however, was very specific. It talked about what we're aspiring for. It talked about what was good and what was bad about your routine, and did so in such a way that gave you clarity so that in the next 3 minutes as you go to prepare for your money round, you can be better equipped to adjust your act accordingly, okay? So just as an example, I know it's kind of a basic example, but when we talk about feedback, feedback is about influencing behavior in the future. And the best way to do that is to make sure, A, we're an effective messenger. B, that we're making those associations between feedback as an instructive, supportive tool for success and not as an opportunity to whack people over the head. And 3, that we're using good old-fashioned behavior science to make our feedback effective. It's timely, it's specific, right? It's unequivocal, it's focused on the future, right? So with that said, I'd like to challenge each of you to kind of step up your feedback game. Go back to the original saying, what we fear in life we avoid, but also what we avoid in life we start to fear. For those of you that are uncomfortable giving the feedback, I'd like to challenge you. Start small and start giving a little more feedback and see if over time that intimidation factor, that paper tiger, starts to get a little softer and eventually able to just be ripped up. Okay. So with that said, we'll bring this to a close unless there are any questions. And you see on the screen there your SHRM PDC credit code that you can use to get your PDC credit.
Thank you so much, Jody, and thank you everyone for your time this afternoon. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out anytime via email. We're happy to work with you, answer questions, and you will also be receiving a copy of the presentation as well as a link to a YouTube recording of our webinar this afternoon. It doesn't seem we have any questions at the moment, so I would like to thank you for your time and hope you have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you and goodbye, everyone.